Well, the latest release of Epstein files have revealed bombshell emails from Sarah Ferguson, the former...
For nearly 40 years, Sarah Ferguson has been one of the most talked about members of the extended British royal family, not for a long reign or a famous title, but for a financial saga so persistent that it has outlasted her marriage, her royal status, and multiple attempts at reinvention. In 2025 and into 2026, that saga collided head-on with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, when a batch of emails surfaced showing just how close her relationship with a convicted sex offender had actually been. The fallout cost her 7 charity patronages, her home, and what remained of her public standing. This is the story of how a duchess who once lived surrounded by staff and privilege ended up financially dependent on one of the most notorious criminals of the last 30 years, told through what's actually documented, not speculation. In July 1986, Sarah Ferguson married Prince Andrew at Westminster Abbey and became the Duchess of York. It was, by any measure, a marriage into extraordinary privilege, the kind of life where money, in theory, should never have been a source of anxiety. But according to royal biographer Andrew Loney, whose 2025 book entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York is based on years of research and interviews, financial trouble followed Ferguson almost from the start. Loney's account describes a pattern of running up large bills at stores, including Harrods, without paying them off, alongside a string of business ventures, including a retirement homes company that went bankrupt, that traded on her royal connections without ever becoming stable sources of income. By 1994, according to Loney's reporting, Ferguson's debts had climbed past £3.7 million. That same year, the private bankouts, long associated with the British aristocracy, reportedly demanded she repay £500,000 within 14 days. It wasn't the only time the palace stepped in. Buckingham Palace later confirmed that Queen Elizabeth II had settled Ferguson's debts on several occasions, involving 6-figure sums, including that 1994 payment. At the time, the palace issued a pointed statement making clear this wasn't an open-ended arrangement. Ferguson's financial affairs, it said, were no longer Her Majesty's concern, and were matters she needed to resolve with her own bankers and advisors. That distancing didn't resolve much. Other reporting from the period describes Ferguson borrowing from friends and falling behind on smaller debts too. A friend who lent her £100,000 for a holiday reportedly had to threaten legal action after receiving only a fraction back. A furniture rental company was left chasing a few £100s in unpaid fees. The pattern that emerges across multiple sources isn't just occasional overspending. It's a long-running mismatch between Ferguson's lifestyle and her actual and often uncertain income. When Ferguson and Prince Andrew divorced in 1996, the financial gap only widened. According to reporting from People and other outlets, Ferguson's settlement was estimated at around $475,000, a fraction of the roughly $22 million Princess Diana received in her own divorce from then Prince Charles that same year. Ferguson herself has suggested the disparity was partly her own choice. In a 2010 interview with Oprah Winfrey, she said she prioritized staying close to the family over securing a larger payout, telling Winfrey, "I chose friendship with the family. I wanted friendship with the boss," referring to the Queen. Whatever the reasoning, the numbers didn't support the lifestyle she continued to live. One account from the period describes her facing a $7.1 million overdraft with Coutts not long after the divorce. A biographer quoted in coverage of the era summed up the dynamic plainly. She had been introduced to a certain way of living and simply kept living it, without the income to sustain it. Over the following decade, further ventures added to the debt rather than resolving it. Her American business venture, Hartmore LLC, collapsed with reported debts of around $1 million. By the mid-2000s, British newspapers were reporting she owed as much as $4 million to roughly 200 creditors, with the Sunday Telegraph later reporting a Buckingham Palace financial advisor had recommended she consider voluntary bankruptcy, something that would have been unprecedented for a member of the extended royal family. One report put her total debts at closer to £5 million, describing the Queen as deeply concerned by figures far larger than previously understood. It's against this backdrop, persistent debt, a shrinking income, and a reluctance or inability to scale back her spending, that Jeffrey Epstein became part of Ferguson's financial life. This is the part of the story that draws the sharpest scrutiny, because of who Epstein was by the time the relationship deepened. Epstein had already been convicted once before most of the financial dealings, described in leaked emails, took place. He served time in Florida after pleading guilty to soliciting prostitution from a minor, and was released from Palm Beach County Jail in July 2009 after serving 13 months of an 18-month sentence. It's in the months and years after that release, not before his crimes were known, that many of the most damaging emails between Ferguson and Epstein were sent. The scale of Epstein's financial support for Ferguson has been reported in different ways across different outlets, with figures ranging depending on the time period covered and the source cited. But multiple reports describe a financial relationship that continued for well over a decade rather than a single transaction. The emails that resurfaced in 2025 and 2026, released as part of a wider tranche of documents connected to the U.S. Department of Justice's handling of the Epstein case, paint a picture of genuine warmth and dependency between Ferguson and Epstein, not just a business arrangement. In an August 2009 email, Ferguson thanked Epstein effusively after a lunch meeting, telling him, "I have never been more touched by a friend's kindness than your compliment to me in front of my girls. Thank you, Jeffrey, for being the brother I have always wished for." In a message dated January 30th, 2010, roughly 6 months after Epstein's release from jail, Ferguson wrote to him, "You are a legend. I really don't have the words to describe my love, gratitude for your generosity and kindness. I am at your service. Just marry me." A separate email from September 2009 shows Ferguson joking that Epstein should marry a woman with a great body, adding, "Okay, well, marry me, and then we will employ her." The emails also document direct requests for money. In one exchange, Ferguson told Epstein she urgently needed £20,000 for rent, adding, "Any brainwaves?" Other correspondence shows discussion of a planned business venture, Mother's Army, in which Epstein was reportedly set to hold a 51% stake, while Ferguson would draw salary, a deal that stalled as scrutiny of Epstein intensified. Some emails also reference her daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, including exchanges about Epstein's associates wanting to meet them, which has added a further layer of discomfort to the disclosures for Ferguson and her family. In March 2011, with public scrutiny mounting, Ferguson gave an interview to the Evening Standard addressing a separate matter, a £15,000 payment she had accepted from Epstein to help with her debts. In that interview, she said, "I abhor pedophilia and any sexual abuse of children and know that this was a gigantic error of judgment on my behalf." She indicated she wanted nothing more to do with him, but the emails later showed that the private relationship didn't end there. The following month, in an email reportedly sent to Epstein, Ferguson wrote that she did not and would not call him a pedophile, and that her public comments had been made to protect my own brand. A separate email described by multiple outlets, reportedly sent around the same period, referred to Epstein as a steadfast, generous, and supreme friend. It was that specific email, surfaced by the Mail on Sunday and reported widely from September 2025, that ultimately triggered the collapse of her charitable relationships. Ferguson's spokesperson has said the message was sent on the advice of her lawyers, after Epstein reportedly threatened to sue her for defamation over the earlier interview linking him to sexual abuse. The consequences arrived quickly once the Supreme Friend email became public in September 2025. Julia's House, a children's hospice charity in the south of England where Ferguson had been patron since 2018, was the first to end the relationship, saying it would be inappropriate for her to continue in the role. Within days, more organizations followed. The Teenage Cancer Trust, where Ferguson had been associated for 35 years, the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, whose founders said they were disturbed by the correspondence, Prevent Breast Cancer, which Ferguson had partnered with after her own breast cancer treatment, the Children's Literacy Charity, the National Foundation for Retired Service Animals, and the British Heart Foundation, which ended her role as ambassador. In total, 7 organizations severed ties within a matter of days, a near total collapse of the charitable network Ferguson had built over more than 3 decades. The Epstein revelations didn't just cost Ferguson her charity work. They also became entangled with the unraveling of Prince Andrew's own royal status. Andrew had already been forced to give up his working royal role and public patronages in 2019 after a widely criticized BBC Newsnight interview in which he attempted to explain his own relationship with Epstein. In October 2025, following what Buckingham Palace described as a formal process, King Charles III stripped his brother of his remaining style, titles, and honors, effectively ending his status as Prince Andrew altogether. He has since been referred to as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. As part of that same decision, the king ordered Andrew to surrender the lease on Royal Lodge, the roughly 30-room residence near Windsor Castle that Andrew and Ferguson had continued sharing long after their 1996 divorce. Because Ferguson lived there too, she was required to vacate the property alongside him, with a reported move-out deadline of January 31, 2026. By early February 2026, according to reporting from the BBC and other outlets, Andrew had left Royal Lodge and taken up temporary residence at Wood Farm on the royal family's Sandringham estate in Norfolk, while a more permanent, described as more modest, residence was prepared for him elsewhere on the estate, funded privately by the king rather than the public purse. Ferguson, notably, did not request or receive a similar arrangement. Reports from People and Fox News in the months surrounding the eviction indicated she was determined to find her own accommodation independently, reportedly looking in Berkshire, where she has lived for most of her life, rather than joining Andrew in Norfolk. Sources cited in that coverage suggested she wanted to remain close to her daughters and grandchildren rather than relocate. As of early 2026, Ferguson's situation remains in flux. She has reportedly spent time overseas while weighing her next move, and her spokesperson said in December 2025 that she was assessing a number of options, with no final decision made. What is clear is that the structures that had propped her up for decades, royal accommodation, charitable patronages, and the benefit of the doubt that came with her former title, have largely fallen away within the space of a few months. Strip away the individual scandals, the 1994 debt crisis, the Coutts ultimatum, the collapsed business ventures, the Epstein emails, and a consistent thread runs through nearly 4 decades of coverage. A persistent gap between the lifestyle Ferguson maintained and the resources available to sustain it, met repeatedly by rescues from other people, whether that was the Queen, friends, or ultimately a convicted sex offender looking for social access and rehabilitation of his own reputation. Reports have suggested Epstein saw the relationship as useful to him too, a way to maintain proximity to royal circles through his connection to Ferguson and, by extension, Andrew. What makes the 2025 and 2026 disclosures different from the earlier debt stories isn't just the scale of the numbers. It's the documentation. Where the 1990s and 2000s financial troubles were largely described secondhand, through biographers, leaked palace statements, and tabloid sourcing, the Epstein emails are primary documents, released as part of a formal U.S. government disclosure process. They don't just describe a financial relationship. They show, in Ferguson's own words, both the warmth of that relationship while it lasted and the discomfort of trying to manage its exposure once Epstein's crimes became impossible to separate from her own public image. Whether Ferguson will recover any of what she's lost, reputation, charitable relationships, financial stability, remains genuinely uncertain. What isn't uncertain is the record now sitting in the public domain. A duchess who spent decades outrunning her own finances, and whose final rescue attempt came from a man whose name is now permanently attached to one of the most damaging scandals in recent royal history.